Thanks for coming. My name is Jacqueline Swartz, and I'm on the board of Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Our organization is a partner to Peace Now, Shalom Achshav, which is Israel's leading peace movement and which promotes the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can find out more about us on our website, peacenowcanada.org. We really hope you'll consider supporting us with a donation, which you can do through our website. We rely entirely on donations by people like you. Our webinar today is the first in our fall series, and we have an excellent turnout for this event. After the formal presentation, we'll have a time for audience questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A. The chat is disabled. And also, if you wish, tell us where you're writing from. Please make your question as concise as you can. My fellow board member and the chair of the Toronto chapter, Bob Cates, will be asking your questions. And our webinar will be recorded and posted on our website. So we are extremely honored to have as our guest today, Professor Derek Penslar, who will be speaking about defining anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And just a few words about Derek. He's currently the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard and a resident faculty member at the Center for European Studies there. His approach takes into account modern capitalism, nationalism, and colonialism. Between 2012 and 2016, he taught at Oxford, where he was the inaugural Stanley Lewis Professor of Modern Israel Studies and is an honorary fellow at St. Anne's College. At the University of Toronto, he was Samuel Zaks Professor of Modern Jewish History. And just a few of his books, Shylock's Children, Economics and Identity in Modern Europe, Jews in the Military, a History. In 2020, he published Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader. A forthcoming book is titled Zionism, An Emotional State. The title reflects Professor Penslar's interest in seeing Zionism through the prism of emotions like love, anger, and fear. Also, he's working on a global history of the 1948 Palestinian War. And now, before I turn this over to Bob Cates, I'd like to ask a question of my own. Professor Penslar, you taught in London, well, Cambridge and Toronto. How, if at all, would you characterize polite anti-Semitism?
Well, I guess if I were going to be polite, I'd say, well, I really wouldn't know. I encountered a fair amount of polite anti-Semitism when I lived in the UK, and however difficult it might be, I actually prefer it to the other kind. It gets its point across, but you are not going to be attacked physically. People express negative views. They might be very bigoted, but I believe that there are ways to communicate with people, even when they're expressing their view, even when their views are not entirely friendly to Jews. So polite anti-Semitism in North America, I think, is much rarer. It was very common in the earlier 20th century or the mid-20th century. It was the kind of anti-Semitism that would keep Jews out of country clubs or perhaps out of the very best law firms. What's happening now is much more, bare knuckle. And so I don't know if the concept of polite anti-Semitism really applies in our current political climate. And I guess I'll be getting to that in a few minutes.
Yes.
My presentation.
I actually intended to ask that question after your presentation. So please begin.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. And it's nice to see so many of you. I just want to say a quick hello. I see that there's some people from overseas, or Jenny Esterman. I don't know where you are, but I know that you're based in Germany. And it's a particular honor to see, I just want to mention my former dean, Pekka Sinervo. It's really honored that you're here this evening. And my colleague in Polish and in Jewish history, Piotr Wróbel. It's really nice to see you, Piotr, and I hope that you've been well. And of course, the whole Holy Blossom Israel Dialogues group. It's nice to see you as well. and Marty Klein. I'm really glad that you're here. And all the way from the holy city of Charleston, South Carolina, Joshua Shane. So this is really very cool. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to bring up some remarks. I'm going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, and then I actually want to show some texts to you. But let me just pull up my documents, just a moment, and I'll share the screen a little later, but right now. All right. So there has been a debate going on. I would say it's been particularly acute over the last 5 years or so, but it has roots that go back probably to the early 21st century. In the wake of the Second Intifada, tensions between Israelis and Palestinians grew ever more lethal, and the spillover into North American academia, North American civil society was, again, it became especially prominent. And so within the Jewish community, ongoing discussions about the extent to which one who claims to be an anti-Zionist, that is to oppose the very existence of Israel as a Jewish state, or to believe that the Zionist project was a mistake, to what extent are such beliefs inherently always anti-Semitic? And I think one problem with that debate over the last 20 years, and particularly the last 5 years or so, is that it's carried out in a vacuum, as if the bigger question of how and when or why a person may or may not criticize a government or criticize a group of people, it's only limited to Israel and Jews. Now, we all know that Jews in Israel attract a lot of attention, but there is a bigger question here. What is permissible within a particular country? What kind of criticisms may a citizen enunciate or write when speaking about a leader, a member of a political elite, a regime, a country as a whole? Where is the line? When is criticism, let's say political criticism, pointing out the failings or the misdeeds or the immorality or even the crimes of a regime or of a country? When is that seen as defaming or threatening the very existence of the country and its citizens? And how does this general set of questions then apply to Israel and anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and so on? Because it won't surprise us to know there are many countries in the world where people do not have the right to criticize regimes freely. But let's just talk about democratic countries for a moment. I was shocked to learn, and with this many people on the call tonight, there's probably all kinds of international legal experts, and you can fill me in more during the Q&A period, that in 17 European countries today, all of them democratic, it is technically illegal to defame the head of state. In Iceland, of all places, if you insult the president of Iceland, you can go to jail, or Slovenia or Spain or whatever. Now, what's strange about these laws is they're usually kind of archaic and not enforced, but every now and then they are. I think there was a case a few years ago in Spain where somebody was sent to jail for saying and making insulting remarks about the police.
Excuse
So
me,
even in democratic, yeah.
Derek, I'm going to interrupt. We've gotten some requests for you to increase your volume. Can you do that?
Oh, my microphone volume.
Yeah.
Oh, I've never, okay, I have to go into preferences, just a second. Just a moment.
It may be possible to do it on the microphone icon.
No, I've got it. I've got it right here. The input volume is, okay, I'll move it up one notch. How's that? Is that better? I've moved it up.
It's fine for me, but we've been getting a lot of notes at requesting a higher volume.
Well, I've raised it, so it's, okay, I've now raised it to like 80%. So it should be quite loud now.
Okay, thank you. I think that'll
Better?
Yeah.
Okay, and now if it gets too loud and you get distortion or something, let me know. So I mean, there even in democratic countries, there are odd limits as to when a person can say negative things about, let's say, the head of state. The really weird thing, though, about these democratic countries is that you can say whatever you want about anybody else. You could make rude comments about the vice president or about representatives or about provincial leaders. So there's something very particular here about the head of state representing somehow the nation in a kind of a spiritual, transcendent form, which we're all familiar with because, in case you didn't know, Queen Elizabeth passed away, and there's been a lot of conversation about her symbolic power, to the point where anti-monarchist demonstrators in the United Kingdom the last couple of days have been getting arrested, for example. So that's a good example that even in democratic countries, there are certain things that you just can't say. All the more so in countries that are illiberal. Illiberal democracies like Turkey and Poland. In Turkey, it is against the law to insult the president, and people go to jail for it for 3 or 4 years. In Poland, you can go to jail for all kinds of things. Recently enacted laws about insulting the honor of Poland, and I'm sure that Professor Rubel could comment more on this. You can technically be prosecuted for insulting the honor of the Polish people for talking about things like mass murders by Polish citizens of Jews during the Second World War. So this is something that is alien, frankly, to North American sensibilities. And that's why it's very important, before we get to the debate about Israel, anti-Semitism, and Jews, that in North America we have a much more, I'd say, open and even free-willing notion that we cherish freedom of speech. And we cherish as constitutional rights and as charter rights in the United States and in Canada. They are limited. You can't say anything you want in any way at any time. There is time, place, and manner restriction to freedom of speech, but there's a very high bar for content. So people can say really abusive things about our leaders, about our other citizens. We can be quite derogatory, and yet it's legal. It might be ugly, it might be irrational, it might be intemperate, but we are allowed to say and write all sorts of things. We also have, I think, under the freedom of speech, we have the right to be wrong. We have the right to be stupid. Now, there are limits in terms of libel laws and defaming people and causing them damage, but we certainly have the right to be viciously critical of our own government, and there are freedoms and rights, even more so, to criticize foreign governments. The fact is that technically, let's say I don't like the Turkish government, and I write something really nasty for a news outlet on the internet about how much I hate Turkey, and I think Turkey should be dismembered, and I don't know, and it should be divided up among Kurds and among all the peoples of the Balkans or whatever. Okay, I don't like Turkey. It is theoretically possible that a Turkish Canadian citizen could take umbrage and sue me. But if I'm making a statement of opinion, and even a statement of fact, the distinction that seems to be growing in American jurisprudence, the fact is it's very unlikely I'm going to get prosecuted or even sued. And the Turkish government might choose to sue me in court, but it's probably not going to happen. In other words, I think you see what I'm getting at. That we live in a culture where people can and do say very harsh things about other countries. Now about Russia. There are in Canada, by the way, people who defend Russia. There are people who think that Ukraine is a terrible place. I don't agree with them. I mean, I have my own strong feelings about who's in the right and who's in the wrong in that situation, but people do have a right to express their views. So Israel is a foreign country. And Canadian citizens and American citizens have the right to express their opinions about it. They have the right to express their opinions about their own countries. The fact that to many diaspora Jews, Israel is not just a foreign country, but rather something they care about deeply and around which they center their lives might be irrelevant from a legal point of view. So I think there's a certain question of what kind of speech, negative speech, speech that we might find personally disturbing or uncomfortable, to what extent we simply have to accept it because we live in a free society. Now, it is true at the same time that Jews are an identifiable or protected group. And there are limits of, you can be accused of racism or of willful promotion of hatred, which is actually a crime in Canada. I know we have people from the United States and Canada, so I'm translating back and forth. If you willfully promote hatred against an identifiable group, defined by racial origin, religion, gender identity, ethnicity, and so forth. But then if we're going to say, for example, that saying harsh things about Israel is promoting hatred, willful promotion of hatred of Jews, if we're going to make that claim, then we have to show some kind of direct connection between someone saying things that are very hostile to Israel, even advocating for Israel's dissolution, for example, and something that is specifically anti-Semitic within the sense that anti-Semitism has been understood for many decades, if not centuries. So that leads us to the question, what is the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? And I think the word anti-Zionism, by the way, is probably a little inaccurate. We're probably better off using the term anti-Israelism, which is a deep hostility to the state of Israel. People might use the term anti-Zionism because Zionism is the ideological scaffolding and the emotional scaffolding that created the state of Israel. And it's the set of beliefs and values that sustains Israel as a Jewish state. But anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism really in our own era are kind of synonymous. And what I want to point out is that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not the same thing. Anti-Semitism, in fact, can be pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist. There is no inherent link between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So I'll make clear, for example, when the Zionist movement began in the late 1800s, many anti-Semites in Europe were thrilled. They were deliriously pro-Zionist. They were quite happy, first of all, because it would get the Jews out of Europe. But they also felt that Jews were showing a bit of honor and self-respect and trying to empower themselves. And Theodor Herzl got fan mail from anti-Semites. They thought he was doing a very good thing. However, after World War I, when the British became the first warlords, as it were, of Palestine, but then were in Palestine by legal right, granted by the League of Nations, anti-Semites began to fear that Zionists, Jews, were manipulating the British Empire and creating a kind of a seedbed for world control. The Nazis, for example, were purely and simply anti-Zionist. And after 1948, when Israel was established, anti-Semitism could be anti-Israeli for all kinds of reasons. For example, if in the 1950s and 60s, there were people in America who viewed Israel as a socialist country because it did have a social democratic government. And there were, of course, in Israel, strong Marxist, strong Marxist movements among sort of the fringes of the left, but very powerful fringes in the kibbutz movement and so on. So you had organizations like the John Birch Society, which loathed Israel because they saw it as a communist bastion. Then more recently, in the 1980s, 90s, and beyond, you've had a lot of anti-Semites who see in Israel a nucleus of Jewish political and financial power. The best example of this is the former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke, former member of the Louisiana State Assembly, who actually is the one who coined the use of terms like Zio-Marxist. So the notion that something that's Marxist is controlled by Jews, therefore it's Zio or Zionist. If you don't like feminism, he used the term Zio-feminism, Zio-environmentalism. Whatever it is, you don't like it, you put Zio before it. So this is obviously classic anti-Semitism. But there are anti-Semites in history who have been, as I mentioned, quite pro-Israel. And this has come back recently. Just to give an example, just a few days ago, an unredacted tape of a conversation from 1972 between Richard Nixon and Billy Graham has been released. It was actually released a few years ago, but now it's being made more widely available. Billy Graham is talking to Richard Nixon, and Graham makes openly, and you should Google this and listen to this, it's quite horrifying, openly anti-Semitic statements about Jews, the Church of Satan and so forth. He doesn't like Jews. And Nixon completely agrees. I mean, there's just no doubt whatsoever that Nixon is, Graham is preaching to the choir, as it were. And yet we know that Nixon could be quite supportive of Israel. Just to give an example, in 1973, the Operation Nickel Grass, which brought something like 20,000 tons of military equipment to Israel during the 1973 war. Well, that was for strategic reasons. And today there are right-wing anti-liberal or semi-fascistic or all-out fascistic political leaders and activists who think Israel is an excellent example of what Richard Spencer, an American white supremacist, calls an ethnically pure, or he calls it a something pure ethnic state. And Orban's Hungary, for example. There's a lot of praise for Israel. I actually felt this, experienced this when I was teaching in Hungary, that I experienced both anti-Semitism and support for Israel from people on the far right, who, as one supporter of one of the far right parties said to me, I admire Israel because it is an ethno-nationalist state trying to maintain its purity, surrounded by enemies. So he didn't like Jews very much, but he liked Israel. So anti-Semitism then can go in either direction. But what about anti-Zionism? I mean, if someone is opposed to Israel in its current form, does that mean they're automatically anti-Semitic? And my answer might seem evasive, but it's not. It all depends on definitions. For example, I think that if you were to look at the Jewish American or Canadian mainstream and ask them, what is Zionism? My guess is you get an answer like this. Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Israel is central to contemporary diaspora Jewish life. So that's 1, 2. And 3, the only legitimate expression of Zionism is support for Jewish sovereignty within either all of the land of Israel or perhaps part of it, if you believe in a two-state option. Okay. I mean, I think that these 3 components, national liberation movement, it's central to our lives, and Jewish sovereignty is the only acceptable way that Zionism should be manifested today. And by this logic, if you accept these 3 principles, then of course, if someone opposes Israel as a Jewish state in its current political form, then you're an anti-Semite. Well, how do you argue with that? Because these are assertions of belief. These are not statements of fact. The fact is, most North American Jews do feel emotionally attached to Israel. If you look at the latest Pew Institute study, Pew Foundation studies, something like 75% of American Jews feel some emotional attachment to Israel, and I'm sure that for Canadian Jews, it's higher. But the depth and the intensity and the valence of those attachments varies quite a bit. I mean, if you look at, again, Canadian Jews have not been surveyed as closely as American Jews, but there are surveys where American Jews are asked, like, here's a bunch of Jewish attributes: observing Jewish laws, going to synagogue regularly, keeping kosher, memorializing the Holocaust, importance of Israel. Israel usually ranks in the middle of the pack, somewhere, well, way behind ethical behavior and just around the same, give or take 1 notch of having a good sense of humor. So having a good sense of humor is considered very important. Israel, sort of right in the middle of the pack. And the fact is, there are North American Jews for whom Israel is not that important. There are those who dislike Israel and want nothing to do with it. And of course, there are those who feel attached to Israel, but want it to undergo a profound change. They want its regime to change. They want it to provide greater equality for Israel's Arab citizens. There's all kinds of things that people might want to express discomfort with Israel. Are such people anti-Semites? And this is really an issue for younger Jews in North America, particularly Jews under the age of 35, who increasingly, I mean, a fairly large chunk of them, are finding Israel either it simply doesn't speak to them, or they're uncomfortable with it. Now, are these people anti-Semites? So that's the question. So is the case of discomfort, okay, you might say, fine, they're uncomfortable with Israel, that's not anti-Semitism. Well, what about people who actually say hostile things about Israel? It's an occupying state, it's a colonial state, it's a racist state, people who make hostile comments about Israel. Well, we do have the freedom in Canada and in the United States to criticize and even condemn foreign countries. So is our fear that by saying negative things about Israel, what people really mean, or what it could very easily lead to, is hatred of Jews, and hatred of Jews everywhere, hatred of Jews in the streets of Toronto or in New York or whatever? Well, we have to remember that negative feelings about Israel are, of course, tied up with negative feelings about Jews. Not all the time, but they have been. I mean, when the State of Israel was created in 1948, Arab and Muslim anger, hostility, fury about Israel's creation was often expressed through anti-Semitic language. The former communist bloc began to lead the third world nations in anti-Israel debates and resolutions at the United Nations as early as 1962, long before the 1975 General Assembly resolution that equated Zionism with racism and colonialism. And there was always an anti-Semitic streak through this kind of rhetoric, with depictions of Jews, as puppet masters, and kind of classic notions of Jewish globalist power. Today they talk about globalism. These ideas go back to really the mid 20th century. And in leftist circles in Europe and in North America, today we might say progressive circles, hostility to Israel, which did often have an anti-Semitic streak, became manifest in the 1960s and 70s, an era of third world anti-colonial militancy, the idealization of revolutionary actors from the Viet Cong to the PLO. And these negative feelings about Israel intensified, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, with the Second Intifada of 2000. And after 2016, heightened racial tension in the United States during the Trump administration and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement caused these feelings to spike even higher, with a conception of intersectional connections between racialized minorities and oppressed indigenous peoples worldwide. So the idea that the oppression of blacks in the United States, the oppression of indigenous people in the United States, but then all kinds of other forms of oppression, including that of Palestinians, are somehow of a piece. And this hostility, I think, reached its zenith during the Israel-Gaza violence of May of 2021, where, among other things that happened in North America, there were cases of violent attacks against Jews, so you have an anti-Semitic element, but also thousands of academics were signing statements of solidarity with Palestinians. So clearly, there is a coterminous occurrence of elevated, as it were, levels of hostility to Israel and anti-Semitic incidents like attacks on the streets of New York, Los Angeles, and so forth in 2021. And what leftist critiques of Israel increasingly involve is not, say, what Peace Now stands for, which is Israeli and Palestinian states side by side, but actually regime change. For Israel to be, as the Palestinians wanted in 1948, a unitary state, a democratic state with full equality for all people who live in it, although obviously Jews have been long concerned about what kind of freedoms and security and assurances they would actually have in such a state. There's been a widespread assumption in the Jewish community that it's not simply that anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Semitic incidents might be occurring at the same time, but that they are deeply linked with each other. And in fact, that anti-Zionism, or this kind of hostility to Israel, it is one and the same with anti-Semitism. And the controversy has really centered around a movement that goes back to 2005 called the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, or the BDS movement. And it's not quite clear because it's a global movement with many different working parts and organized in many different countries. It has diverse goals, and if you actually trawl on the internet, you'll see two very different statements of the BDS campaign's goals. At first, the goals were the complete dissolution of the state of Israel as a state with a Jewish character. There are other versions that are more moderate, but certainly insisting that Israel withdraw from the occupied territories, dismantle any security barriers, fences, walls in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, recognize the Palestinian right to return, that is for Palestinians who are refugees from 1948 and their descendants to return to Israel if they wish, and to grant full equality to Palestinian citizens. And this movement has gotten the state of Israel and Jews throughout the world very, very worried. It's gotten them very concerned, who seeing BDS as the latest chapter in an unrelenting quest by Israel's enemies to destroy the state of Israel. And again, if the state of Israel is central to Jewish life, and Israel is after all a country full of Jews, if these people's lives are in danger, if their political security is in danger, then by definition, then such actions as BDS might be anti-Semitic. The Israeli government is so sensitive to this issue that when Ben & Jerry's ice cream announced in July of 2021 that it would no longer sell its products in the West Bank, Yair Lapid, then the foreign minister, called it, quote, a shameful surrender to anti-Semitism. Now, does this make sense? One thing we can talk about in the Q&A period that really interests me is that the BDS movement has had very few, or really very little in the way of concrete successes. I mean, the state of Israel's economy is thriving. Its universities are thriving. It hasn't suffered, economically, politically. It's true every now and then, a performance artist cancels a concert in Israel, but by and large, it hasn't had much of an effect. So that's one issue: is why is it so frightening to people? The other is, and this is I think a really important thing: is there such a thing as a difference between a rational form of hostility and an irrational form? So, for example, let's say I'm walking across the street and I get hit by a car. I'm not killed, but I get hit by a car and I'm shaken up. And I find out that the driver of the car was Jewish. Well, I have every right to be angry with the driver of the car, but if I say that, I'm angry at him because he's a Jew and I blame it on the Jews as a whole, that's a racist and obviously an anti-Semitic thing to say. A core component of anti-Semitism is its irrationality. It prejudges Jews to be members of a coherent body with common character traits. As Nixon said in his remarks to Billy Graham, they're all so smart. They're all so damn smart. They're smart, they're clever, they're canny, they're whatever, all kinds of attributes. They're shrewd, they're avaricious, and then it goes downhill from there. This is nonsense. There is no coherent entity of the Jews or organized in graveyards in Prague, planning world revolution or planning world economic domination. George Soros does not control the global economy. I mean, this is simply fantasy. But what about negative feelings about a state? The sociologist Max Weber famously said that a state is the only human community within a specific territory that claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. That is, a state can and does wreak havoc on people's lives. It can end their lives. States kill people. Jewish fantasies don't kill people. I mean, fantasies of Jewish domination, these groups don't kill people, but states do. And so what if you've been victimized by a state? Is that hatred that you might feel irrational? If you're angry at the state of Israel because they blew up your home, killed your father, half your family's been in jail, you can't get from one village to the next, you can't lead a normal life. That hatred might be all-consuming, it might be destructive, we might find it very frightening. But is it irrational? Is it anti-Semitic? And I want to quote someone who you'll think is probably the least likely person I would quote at this point, because he's hardly a dove, Moshe Dayan. So in 1956, Dayan gave a eulogy for a young, idealistic Israeli from Tel Aviv who'd gone to live in a kibbutz on the Gaza border, a guy named Ro'i Rothberg. And Ro'i was killed in an altercation with a Palestinian guerrilla. And Dayan, off the cuff, in 20 minutes, wrote one of the most beautiful eulogies you've ever heard. And for those of you who know Hebrew, it's on YouTube. And his Hebrew was magnificent. And this is what he says. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? For 8 years, they have sat in refugee camps in Gaza and seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil and the villages where they and their forebears once dwelled. I mean, he's not saying they're anti-Semites. He's saying they hate us because we took their land. And here we are. So when is hatred of the state of Israel, however much we might find that discomforting, frightening, right, intimidating, unnerving, but is it really hatred of the Jewish people as a whole? The other thing is that if we get away from Palestinians on the ground in Palestine, it is possible, and I've seen this with my own decades of experience, anti-Zionism certainly can stem from hatred. It does. I mean, there's no question that people who hate Israel with a passion, Hatred is an expression of not just that people have done wrong, but that the people whom you hate are malevolent, and you want nothing more than to either destroy them or to have nothing to do with them ever again. And there's no question that hatred can motivate anti-Zionism. But it can also stem from other emotions. For example, there are forms of anger where you have a need, and the psychologists in the audience will be familiar with what I'm saying now. Anger is an expression of an unmet need, and you want that need to be satisfied. Within university settings, as for example, which get a lot of attention because of debates about Israel and Palestine in universities. Within university settings, I see both. That is, I have run across students who really have a kind of hateful streak when they talk about Israel, and their eyes are all fiery and that sort of thing. But I see something else as well, probably more often. Sadness, disappointment, confusion, frustration. A bundle of emotions often characterizes Jewish students, by the way, and faculty who identify as anti-Zionists. They call themselves anti-Zionists. They're not hateful people. And many of them might have connections. They have family in Israel. They've been to Israel. They care about Israel. But they are just confused. They're angry. They're disappointed. They're frustrated. They're not hateful. And I find this at times also among Christian and Muslim students. I mean, there's something we can talk about later. I mean, I've taught lots of Jewish students in my career. I've taught lots of Christian students and lots of Muslim students. And sometimes I feel like people outside of the university community make assumptions about what's going on in the universities that don't bear up with reality. Now, it's true the kind of students who take my classes are willing to walk in my door. But the point is that that kind of negative feeling, these feelings of frustration and disappointment, are not hate. It's something else. Now, you might say, okay, fine, they're frustrated, they're angry, they're not hateful, fine. But why Israel, right? There's lots of other countries in the world that misbehave. Why Israel? And it's true. There are lots of other states that deny human rights. There are other occupations. And it is true that people who know and care little about many other oppressed peoples in the world do get passionate about Israel, even to the point that in English and in German, there's a phrase, right to exist. Does Israel have a right to exist? We often hear this. Israel doesn't have a right to exist. If you look up the term on Google, right to exist, or if you look up the term Existenzrecht, which is the German equivalent, if you do an engram, a Google engram, you'll see that the term was used a little bit in the early 1900s to talk about national movements in Europe, and then it spikes from the 1970s onward. And if you look at, I looked at the top 178 items returned under a Google search for right to exist, and more than 90% of them referred to Israel. And in German, if you look up like Existenzrecht in one of these German websites that gives you examples of how the word is used, they all had to do with Israel. So there's something weird going on here. Is this intensity and awareness because of anti-Semitism? It can be, sure, it can be. It can be for other reasons. First of all, there are people who love Israel. There are people who care much more about Israel in a positive sense than they do about other countries, maybe because of religious reasons or for some other reasons. So the Jewishness of Israel can cut both ways. The fact is, Israel happens to be located in a territory venerated by close to half of humanity. When you add, 2.5 billion Christians and 1.5 billion Muslims, you get about half of humanity. If Israel had been founded, let's say, as a Christian state, by Protestant enthusiasts as a latter-day Crusader kingdom, and if they'd done the same thing to the Palestinians in 1948, we would have a lot of hostility today towards this Christian state. Even if Christian evangelical Protestants from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, came just as today, half of the Jews of Israel are Afro-Asian, right? They're not European, and yet Israel is called often a colonialist state, and that kind of argument would still be made if Israel were a Christian state, because there would be so much anger that there was something seen as foreign to the Middle East, and that had dispossessed the Palestinian people. So I'm saying then that we need to think at least about the difference between anger and hatred, the difference between outright hostility and maybe softer forms of negative feelings. It makes understanding the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism very difficult. And I just want to finish by looking very briefly, I'm not going to do this for very long, at a couple of documents. I put on the, no, I don't want it, just a second. So I'm going to share my screen now, and my computer's going to freeze in just a second. I'm going to share my screen, and this is going to take just a second here to, that's not working because, yeah, there's a trick to sharing when you've got a Mac. There we go. That should work now. Yep. So you should see a document in front of you, do you? Okay. So many groups that are supportive of Israel would like to see a very wide application of a definition of anti-Semitism that was created actually back in 2004 by a working group on racism within the European Union. And it was endorsed in 2016 by the International Holocaust Research Alliance. People often call it the IHRA or IRA definition. They didn't write it. But anyway, they endorsed it. And it has been accepted by hundreds of state governments, both federal governments and like provincial or state governments, corporations, universities. It's very widely used. And there are people who would like to see it more widely used because they believe that this will somehow help to determine when speech about Israel is not just critical, but anti-Semitic. Because the idea is you can be critical, but you can't be anti-Semitic. Well, I'm not sure. I've just put in red a couple of things that strike me as interesting. The very first sentence, that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Well, what else could it be? Right? I just find that very vague. But I'm more concerned about something just a few lines down below. Criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Well, I teach at a university in the United States, where students often say that the United States is a racist country. They say it's a settler colonial country. I taught for almost 20 years at the University of Toronto, and I went to events where Indigenous student activists spoke about the need to dismember Canada and to return it to the Indigenous peoples. I had students in Canada who were separatists and who wanted to see Quebec, for example, form a separate nation state within Canada. So in the world, there are criticisms of states as racist, colonialist, and so on. So then you'd think it would be all right, according to this definition, to make those statements about Israel. And yet, often people who invoke this definition do so in order to claim that talking about Israel as racist or settler colonial or something is anti-Semitic. But the definition doesn't really give us much guidance about that. The definition says that it's anti-Semitic to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. But again, there are people all over the world who call countries racist. So why would it be a problem calling Israel racist? I'm not saying you have to agree with them. Also down below here, applying double standards is anti-Semitic, requiring of Israel behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Okay. Well, how many democratic nations have an occupation that's been going on for 55 years? How many democratic nations are settling that territory with hundreds of thousands of their own citizens? I mean, the fact is that the occupation, there are other occupations in the world. There's Tibet, there's the Western Sahara, there's the horrors that are being committed against the Uyghurs in Southwest China, in Western China. But those aren't democracies. So, and the really interesting thing, I'm going to stop about the IRA with this, is that people who tend to support this definition are often ones who define the boycott movement as anti-Semitic. The word boycott doesn't appear once in this definition. There's actually nothing about boycotts in this definition. So it's not a very helpful definition, and it's interesting to me how it's become a kind of a fetish. It's become a kind of a text that is idealized and symbolic of a defensive and affectionate, as it were, possession towards Israel. And I just want to finish now by looking at one other thing. Can you see this other document, or do I have to? It's called it says the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Is it showing up? Nope.
No, it's not. It's not.
Okay, then I will do this the old-fashioned way. Just a second. There we go. Oh, come on. There we go. Share screen. Share screen. JDA. Okay, now you should see it. Yeah, cool. So what happened is there were two other groups that decided to come up with maybe a clearer definition of anti-Semitism, one called the Nexus Task Force. And it was basically a group of rabbis, Jewish studies professors who came up with a definition in, I think, 2020, late 2020, early 2021. And then this one called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism that came out a little later. They're very similar. And but the Jerusalem Declaration got more attention. They had better PR. They publicized it more. And I just want to show how this Jerusalem Declaration tries to deal with the subject in a somewhat different way. It's much more clear. It offers like a longer definition of anti-Semitism in the very beginning. But what it also does, and this is something that some people really like and some people do not like, is that it places anti-Semitism into the framework of racism. That is, it is racist to make sweeping negative generalizations about a given group, and this is true for anti-Semitism. Because the general gist of this document that was produced in Jerusalem by a kind of consortium of British, I think, American, Israeli academics, one that's really important and central to this document is that anti-Semitism and racism are really of a piece, and that the struggle against anti-Semitism has to recognize this and needs to make common cause with those who are suffering from racism, as opposed to seeing anti-Semitism as something unique unto itself. So that is kind of an underlying theme in this document, which again, some people find very inspiring and other people find worrisome. The document goes through a lot of sort of, I'd say, very traditional understandings of anti-Semitism in terms of conspiracy theory or associating Jews with evil. And it also makes clear that there's anti-Semitic speech and there's anti-Semitic action, striking someone or vandalizing property, vandalizing a synagogue, or, harming an individual. These are criminal actions and they're clearly anti-Semitic ones. And Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. And of course, this document then goes on to say there are ways that people talk about Israel sometimes that are anti-Semitic. And, if you say that the state of Israel is somehow part of a global Jewish conspiracy to, control the world's wealth or something, requiring people because they are Jewish to publicly condemn Israel, which has happened at like activist events that are pro-Palestinian. They'll say Jews aren't allowed in unless they sign a document that they denounce Israel. Well, this kind of thing is unacceptable. So what's interesting to me is that so far this document sounds fairly, I would say, supportive of Israel. Perhaps you might even define it as Zionist. And yet, this document's gotten a lot of flack. A lot of people in mainstream Jewish organizations are very upset with it. And you'd think so. So far, I've talked about 10 points that it makes that are all, it seems, pretty vanilla. But then the final 5 points are things that have gotten some people upset. For example, this document says it's not anti-Semitic to support Palestinians' desire for justice. If Palestinians want equal rights, is it really anti-Semitic to support that Palestinians deserve human rights or collective rights? Is it anti-Semitic to talk about what form the state of Israel and a future state of Palestine or a state of Israel-Palestine should take? I remember in the 80s, the idea of a two-state option of a Palestinian state and a Jewish state was considered anathema to Zionists. And then came the Oslo process and the idea of maybe a Palestinian statehood, and it became quite widely accepted. And today, people are very nervous, not about that, but they're more nervous about the idea of maybe some kind of unitary state. I personally don't really see how a unitary state could work, but I would not call people who favor talking about these kinds of arrangements anti-Semites. I'd say they're people who have a different political vision, and I would want to talk with them and learn from them about how they think this could be done. The JDA also says that it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel based on evidence. For example, to say that Israel practices systematic racial discrimination against Palestinians. That's not anti-Semitic, it's just a fact. And to use language about colonialism or apartheid, it is certainly contentious, and there are people who get very upset when those words are used. There are scholars, though, who are quite eminent and who are quite calm, rational people who study Israel within the context of 20th century colonialism. The fact is the early Zionists talked quite openly about their debt to colonialism. And, it's not anti-Semitic to talk about the legacy of colonialism and how it affects Israel and Zionism. And the same thing with apartheid. I mean, I know it's a word that gets people very upset. It may or may not apply to Israel, but to even mention it, to even talk about it, the fact is there are scholars who have done very careful work on this. And should we not listen to them? Should we not read their work? Should we simply close our ears to them? That's really what this document is trying to say. And then come statements here that, again, have been somewhat controversial. For the Jerusalem Declaration, if people want to boycott a country, they can boycott a country. Boycott is a widely used form of civil protest. I personally don't support the BDS movement at all. There are people who do. They can do that if they want. And to boycott a state, to get back to what I said earlier, to boycott a state is not the same thing as, let's say, boycotting the Jews in Nazi Germany and refusing to buy at their stores. It is illegal, as I said, in the United States to boycott identifiable groups. And there's this question in the United States about, for example, whether it's okay for someone to refuse service to a gay couple or whatever. Although actually, it seems like with our Supreme Court, that is being allowed these days. And then the final thing is the idea of a double standard. And it is true that Israel gets talked about more than other countries. Its misdeeds come to light more than those of other countries. That is absolutely true. And I once asked a newspaper editor of a good newspaper, why that's the case? I say, why Israel? And he said, one reason only. My readers want to read about Israel. They care about Israel. And they might be Jewish, they might not be Jewish, they might like Israel, they might not like Israel. They care about Israel, it matters to them. And so we publish a lot about it. So it's not necessarily anti-Semitic to be focusing on Israel more than other countries. So again, this document is not perfect. No attempt to deal with this subject is perfect. I do think that people who are critical of the Jerusalem Declaration haven't read it. Just as many people who support the IRA definition haven't read it. But now we've had a chance to look at both documents, and whatever comments I had before, I hope you found them useful, and I look forward to your questions. Yeah, we have a good half an hour, so that's great. So I'll stop here. You are muted. You are still muted.
Sorry about that. I just was copying the questions into a different format.
Okay.
Get back in time. Thank you very much. We've got an awful lot of questions already. And I don't know how we'll get through to all of them, but we're going to make a start.
Yeah, we're going to bundle them also.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. First question from Alan Fox. Who is an activist, a professor, and all sorts of interesting things. And he's been in Israel many times, and he's a longtime supporter of Shalom Ashav. And he asked the question, incidents of anti-Semitism seem sky high, but without a breakdown into subcategories, it's difficult to compare them to attacks on other religions. Vile graffiti, personal derision is hateful, but should not be placed in the same category as murder. There are no recent incidents of mass murder of Jews in Canada, but mass murder of Muslims has been seen, most recently the 2017 mosque shooting that killed 7 Muslims in Quebec City, and the 2021 killing of a Muslim family of 4 in London, Ontario. And then he asks this very biting question, how many incidents of anti-Semitic graffiti are equal to 1 Muslim murdered?
That's a fair question. There's a couple of responses. One is that, look, anti-Semitism is rising. There's no question about it. There's more and more incidents, whether it's vandalism or whether it's also assaults. However, I can't prove this, but people who work on hate crime and incidents of hatred in Canada and the United States tell me that there are all kinds of targeted groups that are less likely to report the crime than Jews. So Islamophobia, for example, Islamophobic incidents are rife. And I left the University of Toronto a while ago, but I remember hearing back in 2015, 16 about some just horrific incidents of Muslim students being assaulted, physically assaulted. And I think there's a great deal. We're living in a very violent, angry epoch, and all sorts of, again, racialized or minoritized groups are being targeted, and Jews are being targeted. But there is no question that other groups are as well, and this is why I do favor the spirit of the JDA, that we're talking about a widespread issue here that is not just about Jews. And it is true that, on the one hand, it's true Muslims have been killed and Jews in Canada haven't. But after all, there have been these, horrific shootings and killings in churches and in synagogues in the United States. And I do understand why Jews feel physically insecure in light of all of these incidents. But I think the answer is not to somehow compete. The answer is to work together and to say, these Islamophobic incidents, these anti-Semitic incidents all have common features, and they have to be combated together.
Okay. I noticed that a couple of people have raised their hands, and if you could put your questions into the Q&A, I'm able to read them. If you raise your hand, I'm not able to have live questions, and I apologize for that. We just weren't able to make that work tonight. Next question is from Harry Russian, who is a longtime JSpace supporter. Why is Israel the only country that I know of that constantly has to defend its right to exist?
Well, again, it's something I said earlier, like the term right to exist is used, really only with reference to Israel. I suspect, and I can't prove it, and I want to be honest, when there's something I know for fact, I'll say it, and when there's something where it's just speculation, there is a long Christian tradition of supersessionism that, Judaism established the basis of true religion, and then Jesus came and Christianity came to the earth and the Jews were superseded. And I think there is a kind of secularized form of supersessionism that Jews should not, as it were, reconstitute themselves as a political power. There is a longstanding Christian belief that the loss of Jewish sovereignty, the loss of Jewish power, the loss of the Jewish state in antiquity was a divine punishment and a sign that the Jews have been punished or are being punished for not recognizing Jesus as their savior. Now, I'm not saying that people today are necessarily aware of all of this theological baggage. I mean, some are, but most aren't. But I do think there is a discomfort in much of the world, by no means all, but in much of the world, with Jews, again, reconstituting themselves as a politically empowered entity. So there is that. There's also, though, other reasons that I mentioned earlier. The fact is, if the state of Israel had been founded in Patagonia, things may have turned out differently. Or if they'd been founded in, the Gobi Desert or something. But to found the Jewish state in the historic Terra Sancta, Holy Land, with its centrality for Christianity and for Islam, it's going to guarantee attention, both negative and positive. And the fact is that the Christian churches in 1948, I'm working on this now, a lot of them were very, very unhappy about the creation of the Jewish state. Not necessarily, well, there was anti-Semitism at times. It was also just this question of, what's going to happen to our holy places, who will guarantee them, and so on. So it's not just because of anti-Semitism, that there's so many other reasons. Just to answer your question quickly with a joke, but The Onion, which is the very important source of news, it's a satirical newspaper, had a great fake headline from May of 1948. Jewish state created between Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt. Now all of our problems are solved, says exultant Ben Gurion. Right? This was not going to be a recipe for easy sailing. So there are many reasons why Israel finds itself having to justify itself.
Okay, that just quick interjection. A number of people have asked if we could post the documents. The documents are included in your invitation, and if you don't have that for any reason, we're going to include that when we post this on our website. Now, here's a really interesting question from Iser Dubinsky. Do you think Pierre Palaver's comments about WMF are anti-Semitic?
I don't know what those were, so someone tell me. What did he say?
Could you put that in the Q&A, and then I'll be able to respond, and I'll give you another question in between.
Yeah.
Marie Rubin asked, would you not accept anti-Zionism is tied up with the politics of the nation that it spouses it, and self-interest plays the biggest part?
Not entirely, no. I think that there are, for example, in the Middle East, it is true that Middle Eastern states have benefited from anti-Israel sentiment because it provides a kind of common denominator and a way of uniting public opinion against a common enemy. Because these states they're riven with conflict and they're unstable and there's a lot of economic inequity. So in that sense, there's a certain element of self-interest. But one thing that really strikes me, and I just read this today for the book I'm working on now, that the smoke hadn't even cleared from the 1948 war, and the Arab states and Israel are talking about a ceasefire and a possible peace agreement. The one thing that the Arab states say before we can talk about anything else, borders, anything else, is the Palestinian refugees. So this is before they've come into these Arab countries and set up, refugee camps, and UNRWA has gotten involved in this whole situation. And you see it over and over again over a period of several months. You've got to deal with this issue. That's not self-interest, really. That's something else. I think it's a matter of principle. We may not agree with them or whatever, but it was a matter of principle. And certainly in the academic world or the world of peace activism in North America and in Western Europe, the concerns say for Palestinians that leads people to be anti-Zionist. No, I don't think it's self-interest. I think it is a worldview that believes that there are people who've been oppressed, who have basic human rights that are being denied to them. Where I disagree with these people is not, I don't deny their sincerity. The question is simply, how do we go about affecting this change? But that's not accusing these people of being anti-Semites. That's just saying, I don't think that what you're saying can really work. How can we work together to come up with a better solution? Now, having said that, and I mentioned this at the beginning, I have encountered plenty of anti-Semites over my years of teaching and interacting with the community, with students, with faculty. It certainly exists, but so I'm saying self-interest is probably not the only reason.
Okay. I'm going to jump over to somebody just because he was on, I think it's an important position, and I'll answer the question myself. My friend Frank Bialystock was a bit late coming in and didn't get the early part. And he notes that he was on the IHRA committee. And so he's really interested to see the beginning of the lecture. Frank, it'll be on our website in a couple of days. And thank you for asking that.
Hi, Frank. I see that Howard Adelman raised his hand. So Howard, if you can put your question into the Q&A.
I think I've got Howard's question. It's
okay.
Just I haven't come to it yet, and
That's okay.
I'll grab it as soon as I can.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to a slightly long question. Jonathan Gendler, who is on our board of directors of Canadian Friends of Peace Now, two things that differentiate anti-Israel emotions from other types of anti-foreign government are: one, the lack of differentiation in many cases between hating the government and hating the people. Two, the singling out of Israel compared to other states. And then he refers to what you said earlier, Ben and Jerry's is a perfect example of the other. So is the singling out of Israel in the UN. What is it about Israel that's so different from other countries when it comes to the criticism it draws?
Well, it's interesting. Israel's a democratic country. Israelis elect their government, which isn't the case in autocratic countries. And I'm just wondering right now, how much anger is there in the world just against Putin and his regime, or are people angry at the 70% of the Russian people who favor the Ukraine war? I think there's a certain amount of anger against Russians as well. Um, I mean, this is an important issue. Israelis elect their governments, and we're going to have elections in November. And we've read that the joint party of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir could get something like 10, 11 seats. That this is a democratic process. One thing about Israel, it has free and fair elections, and it has peaceful transitions of power. The Americans could learn something from Israel when it comes to elections. But the content of those elections might be worrying. And so I'm not saying that this actually explains everything, because we can always retreat to the fact that Israel is singled out because of anti-Semitism. That's a kind of a comfortable space, I would think, for some of us to inhabit. It simply doesn't explain the whole thing. So that's about the issue of a democratic country producing a government that represents the will of its and the views of its citizens. And the other one is about Israel being singled out at the UN. I mean, there's no question about this. And some of you probably saw the video from a few years ago of the UN interpreter who was interpreting a litany of anti-Israel General Assembly resolutions. And at one point, she didn't know that she was still on the camera. And she says, "This is a bit much, isn't it?" And she says, like, I know Israel, does, but she says, there's a lot of bad shit in the world. So yes, obviously it happens. And I'll say something a bit unorthodox, but it's something I do believe, that although Israel's opponents criticize it for its power, right, the power of its army, the power it holds over the Palestinians, all true. The fact is that if Israel were the size of China, and if it had 1 billion people, the criticism would be more muted. But the fact is that Israel is both powerful enough to maintain an occupation for 55 years, but it is not a superpower. And that combination of power and vulnerability, I think, provides a kind of opportunity for criticism, which again, many people find to be a sign of Israel's own vulnerability.
I have possibly the unique question of the night.
Okay.
Somebody has asked about the statue of Theodor Herzl sitting to your right on the bookshelf, and wondered what position he played on the Maple Leafs.
I'm so glad you asked. David, I don't know if you're online, but David Matlow is an attorney in Toronto, has the world's largest collection of private collection of Herzliana and all kinds of Zionist memorabilia. He has a wonderful library. I've worked in his library. He's incredibly generous and kind human being. And he also is quite an aesthete, and he makes up all kinds of interesting Herzl products, including the limited edition Herzl bobblehead. There we see him, see number 97 for 1897, the year of the first Zionist Congress, and the blue and white. So either he's representing the state of Israel or the Maple Leafs, and for his sake, I hope it's the former. So there you go. That's the bobblehead.
Now, Amnesty International recently put out a report that accused Israel of practicing the crime of apartheid. They rested their accusation on a definition that categorized Jewish Israelis as a racial group. Do you accept their characterization on which their whole argument was based?
Well, I don't think their whole argument was based on that. I think they made a strategic mistake by using the term race. The term race in an American context has ongoing relevance in the 21st century because of the peculiar relationship between Black and white Americans, the history and legacy of slavery, and the ongoing oppression of Black people in the United States. Race, the term has some application in Western Europe, perhaps with tensions between immigrants from, let's say, from sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa and people of European origin. In Israel, we can't really talk about, I mean, half of the Jews of Israel I mentioned earlier are Afro-Asian, right? North African, and then Middle Eastern, Persian, all sorts of things. The other half are from all over Western to Eastern Europe. Israeli Jews constitute certainly they're citizens of a state. They constitute members of a nationality. One could call them a nationality comprised of several ethnic groups, but a race is a kind of a supra-ethnic term, and I don't even know why we would use that term in something other than an American context. What the Amnesty Report does, though, that I think is right, I mean, it does talk about the systematic oppression and discrimination that is going on in the state of Israel, but I think they really muddied it up by using the term race. They also muddied up the criticism by conflating, in some ways, the position of Israeli Arab citizens with those of the Palestinians in the occupied territories. And I'm not going to deny the discrimination against Israel's either Arab citizens or Palestinian citizens. Both terms are used, and some people prefer one or the other. But there's a qualitative difference between people who have basic social rights and those who don't. People have certain economic opportunities and those who don't. There's a huge difference, however difficult the position might be for those who are citizens of Israel. So anyway, that's my opinion about the Amnesty Report.
Okay. I've got a clarification of the question that was asked earlier about Pierre.
Yeah, what did he say?
Okay, I've just got to grab this for a moment. Essentially, it's that he was speaking about the World Economic Forum and his dislike of the World Economic Forum.
Mm-hmm.
And the standard trope that it's a Jewish thing. And he's wondering, can you say Pierre Poilievre is anti-Semitic because of that?
Well, I'd have to read what he said. I mean, if he mentioned Soros, by name as a globalist or something, then I think we're getting into dangerous waters. But the fear of, appealing to nativism and populism and conjuring up fears of global economic systems over which we have no control. It's very similar to the language that was used by Nigel Farage when he was protesting against the European Union in the lead up to the Brexit referendum. Now, Nigel Farage, I don't know if he's an anti-Semite or not. I know I'm not very fond of him, but anti-Semitism wasn't really an issue in the Brexit referendum. It was this notion of a lack of control over our economic lives, and that we want to be, to coin a phrase, maître chez nous. And so I'm not sure that that is necessarily anti-Semitic. And I don't know anything about Poilievre's views about Jews. There probably are people, on the line who know much more about his background than I do.
Okay. Got one from your colleague, friend of mine, also Martin Klein. And I've just got to grab that again. Do you think Arab Israelis can ever become full citizens?
Well, they can.
Or I think he means, is it likely?
Yeah. There are signs of incremental change, although there's enormous challenges. We know the bad news. Education gaps, economic gaps, the fact that even when Israel's Arab citizens have economic opportunities, for example, I think they're 30% of the students at the Technion, Institute of Technology, sort of like the Israeli equivalent of MIT. But then what happens to them when they graduate? How many of them can get jobs? Because they haven't been in the army, they can't get security clearance, so what happens to them? And those are the lucky ones, right, who go to the Technion. So, and there's lots of bad news to go around. However, the fact is there are increasing percentages of Israeli Arabs who are going to university. There are certain job opportunities that are opening up for them in high tech, in sort of, as it were, incubators that are being created that can employ people. They employ Israeli Arab citizens in high tech. There is the medical profession, which has always been the exception to the rule, of Israel's Arab citizens being able to attain prestige and positions where they can really make a difference in the world. So there's incremental improvement. There is an overall, I'd say, very difficult situation, but the real issue right now, and this is something that could be addressed without the utopian solutions that we might have in mind, is the issue of rising crime within Israeli Arab communities, gang crime and so forth, and the neglect of these communities by Israeli governments. It's certainly a situation we're familiar with from the United States. And I don't, this is something that can be fixed and can make a big difference, because we saw in 2021 the anger that was directed by Israel's Arab citizens against Israeli Jews in terms of attacking Jews and burning down synagogues, and it went the other way as well. But I think the best way to alleviate that is to realize that Israel's Arab citizens have to be certainly treated equally. There's no question about it right from the start in an economic perspective. And then broader questions about political participation and so forth. I do think that change can happen, but it's going to be incremental. And this is where I differ with the unitary state model, the notion that somehow, Israel can become immediately a state that is truly democratic, because Israel's not truly democratic right now. A state that is truly democratic, in which it's all of Israelis, Jews, and Arabs, and those living under occupation now, and that they all have truly equal status. It's very hard to imagine that happening. But I do see signs of incremental improvement, and I do see ways that they can be more effective.
Now, I'm going to skip a question from somebody named one of our board members named Bernard Bobot, because although it's quite a brilliant question, it's long. And if I read this aloud, that would take up probably the rest of this presentation. So I'm going to ask Bernard, please submit that to me as an email, and I will pass it on to Dr. Penslar.
Please do.
And because I think the question is brilliant, just no way that we can manage it right now tonight. Our president of Canadian Friends of Peace now, not president, our chairperson, Gabrielle Gallagher, asks, do you think pressure to adopt the IHRA definition has actually done more harm than good to Jews, Israel, and Zionism?
I don't think it's done any harm at all. I think it actually has virtually no effect whatsoever. And this is something that I was getting at earlier, I'll make more clear. I think that the IHRA definition and the JDA definition, both these documents have become totems. They've become kind of symbolic of something that really has nothing to do with the document itself. So if a corporation or a university says we've adopted the IHRA, what it means is that they're against anti-Semitism. Well, they didn't need to, they're against anti-Semitism. It's just a way of their saying that. The content of the document, as we said, is really rather, it's really rather blurry and confusing. So I find the debates that are going on within Jewish communities about this definition or that definition, they don't have a whole lot of significance. And if a university adopts the IHRA or they adopt the JDA or whatever, the only difference is, and this is really the only issue that matters for me as an academic, is of course I want to see anti-Semitic hateful speech called out. And I want to see anti-Semites who commit acts of violence or intimidation or harassment prosecuted. Full stop. What I want there to be is an open space for people, whether it's in a university environment or elsewhere in civil society, who want to talk about Israel and Palestine, who want to talk about things that are uncomfortable, right? Israeli Zionists and anti-Zionists, Israeli Jews, diaspora Jews, and Palestinians can talk, and the Palestinians can say, no, Zionism is racist, Zionism is colonialist, we have to have a one-state option, you have to recognize the right of return, and we can talk, we can listen to them. I'm just asking us to listen and not brand this kind of speech automatically as anti-Semitic, and then we never learn anything, right? We just remain inside of our own, as they say these days, echo chamber. I want to protect that space for what could be constructive conversation. And the IHRA in and of itself is actually kind of harmless. That's not the issue. The issue is what people are making of it, that it somehow means that we then can declare all kinds of speech unacceptable. And that's what worries me.
I have a very interesting question that relates quite closely to the university experience. Mm-hmm. Michelle Rivkin-Fish says, in my university, an instructor spoke out against Zionist dirtbags on the instructor's personal social media account. The university rejected requests from the Jewish community to sanction this instructor or prevent them from teaching the course on Israel-Palestine citing academic freedom. My question is, how would you suggest that those of us concerned with promoting respectful dialogue about Israel-Palestine and fighting anti-Semitism would address a case like this of contemptuous, irrational speech?
Yeah, it is contemptuous speech, and it's childish and it's vulgar. And I think this puts students in the unfortunate position of having to be more mature than their professors, because there are charter rights to say what you want to say on Twitter and other social media. People are allowed to say these things. I said at the beginning of my remarks. And a professor who teaches about Israel-Palestine does have the right to be an anti-Zionist. I mean, that is their personal freedom of conscience. But I would say, I would ask the student, or I think the student could ask the professor, you know, what do you think is accomplished by referring to Zionist dirtbags? What's the pedagogic value of this? I mean, how does this enhance our understanding of the history, the politics of the region? I mean, and the professor might not have a good answer. But unfortunately, and I'm saying this to other students out there, this is one of these situations where you have to grow up maybe a little faster than you might have wanted to. This is advice I've given to my students at Harvard, who sometimes have encountered maybe nothing quite that vulgar, but they've encountered some difficult situations. And I say it goes both ways. First, if you have strong connections to Israel, you have to have the courage to maintain those connections. But if you do learn things or come across things about Israel that you didn't know before that are a bit disturbing, don't run away from it, confront it. So it means maturity on both ends, that is standing up for your attachments to Israel, but also being willing to learn about maybe the other sides of Israel's history and current situation that you might rather not know about. And it goes both ways. And I'm very sorry that the professor did that. It really is childish and vulgar.
Now, a lot of the people who've submitted questions have simply not asked a question, but said, thank you so much for this presentation. It's really excellent. I really appreciate it. And I'd love to be able to print all these because a lot of them, I'm sure, will be people you know. But we're pretty near the end, and so I'm going to have to limit it to just one more question.
Sure.
And I hate to do that, but it's the only way. And this is from Wolf Ehrlichman. Have you ever looked at Israeli school books? They totally ignore Palestinians.
Yeah, I actually have. It's a big problem. You know, there are people in the Jewish community in the state of Israel who have complained, understandably so, about Palestinian textbooks, but you're absolutely right. Israeli textbooks have accounts of the history of Jews in the land of Israel, the Zionist movement, the 1948 war, and so forth, that are highly sanitized. And there have been such kerfuffles when there have been some attempts in recent decades to simply present what I would consider to be a completely unobjectionable factual point of view. I attended meetings that actually brought together Palestinian and Israeli Jewish high school teachers to create some kind of narrative they could agree upon. And it was amazing where there was one thing that the Israeli Jewish high school teachers had written, and I read it, and I said, but you know it's not true. And they said, well, yeah, but we want to at least be able to correct another error here. And there's only so far we can go before the education ministry basically slaps us down. So this is a very serious problem. I have learned from my Israeli friends, and you know, whose kids are now out of university, but that Israeli children, Jewish children, grow up not knowing how many Palestinians lived in Palestine, the land of Israel, in 1948. They don't know anything about the Palestinian national movement, the Palestinian economy, Palestinian culture. They know one name. They know the name of Mohammed Amin al-Husseini as the Palestinian national leader, who was a collaborator with the Nazis during World War II. And he was. But to reduce the whole history of pre-1948 Palestinians to Amin al-Husseini is really horribly inaccurate. So I completely agree with your statement.
I apologize to everybody where we couldn't get to your questions. This could have gone on for another couple of hours, but I'm going to turn this back now to Jacqueline, who has been very excellent moderator.
Thank you very much. Professor Penslar, this has been just more than illuminating, it's been really important. And I think it gives us all material to think about and to read. And we don't always get as many thank yous as Bob said you got. So let me express our appreciation. Wish we could have you back multiple times, but
I'll be happy to come back, and who knows, maybe someday we can do things in person. Harvard is now moving towards kind of a mixed model. There will be some events in person, some events will be remote. So maybe.
oh, great. We'd love that.
Yeah.
So just a big warm thank you very much.
Thank you all, and it was really nice to see the names, at least, of so many people whom I know, and I'm in and out of Toronto this year, so hopefully I'll see some of you.
I have a quick question for everybody in the audience. Have you considered making a donation to Canadian Friends of Peace now? We're a nonprofit charitable organization, and we rely completely on donations. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, I think we're going to end it right now. And who knows, maybe we can have an in-person event with you, Derek, if you're in Toronto, now and again. We're going to hold you to that anyway.
Okay, well, Shana Tova, everybody.
Shana Tova. Okay, bye-bye.